A chuirde tá anáthas a bheith an seo libh I Listowel tráthnóna. It is with a deep sense of privilege that I welcome the opportunity to speak to you about Bryan MacMahon, master, storyman and friend, whose friendship, example and words were and continue to be such an inspiration. Tá me labhart an seo tráthnóna mar gcoinne de mhuintir an bhaile, mar ba linne brian agus ba le brian muisne. This evening, we will recollect, reflect, and review. Recollect the master and friend, reflect on his perspective and philosophy of life, and review some of his work and writings. During the course of this presentation, I will project some photographs. A lot of them were taken by myself, and some were given to me by Bryan and his family over the years. Some of what I will show were originally taken by Brendan Landy, our own renowned photographer from Listowel, and I am most grateful to him for permission to use them in this talk. But before I talk about Bryan, I wish to pay tribute to the important work of the Shanachie Centre and to you, Cara, for your direction and guidance since the beginning. I wish to pay particular tribute to Jimmy Deenahan. He it was in 1995 who gathered a small group of people from Listowel and North Kerry to his offices in Dublin, with the express purpose of raising funds for the proposed North Kerry and Literary Centre. Through his leadership, as well as the chairmanship of Machala, Éamon Ó Murchú from Lixna, we organised a series of concerts and events in Dublin and further afield, and were able to present monies in the region of €100,000 towards the Shanachie Centre. Photos on the top left and right were taken on the occasion of the presentation of the cheque in Listowel. And this is but one of the many achievements of the great Jimmy Deenahan, who for so long and so consistently has done so much to promote and perpetuate the unique literary and artistic heritage of North Kerry. Mar a déarach brian hain, tá sé molta da mainse im host. It was Jimmy who also commissioned and raised funds for the sculpture of Bryan by Hugh Hanratty, atá taobh leis an ionad seo I Necha an Chosláin. Údar agus ide. I referred to Bryan recently in a talk I gave as Máiste na Cruthíochta, Fear na Scéalaíochta, Sí na Sálaíochta agus Lóchran na Litríochta. I first want to talk to you about what I would describe as the essential Bryan MacMahon. There was a fundamental principle, a basic philosophy held by Bryan that permeated, influenced, and directed all that he did as teacher, writer, and human being. On the 29th of September 1983, it was my pleasure and privilege as president of the Reading Association of Ireland at the time to invite Bryan to address and open our 8th annual conference. His address was entitled Silence, Intimacy and the Lamp. It was inspirational, and aspects of it were developed in much greater detail later in his autobiographical masterpieces, The Master and the Storyman. During the course of his address, he told how the story of a simple remark by a fisherman on the west coast of Kerry opened up for him some of the great wonders of the world in one sentence. Seo mar a dúirt sé. I mbaile an dúinín a bhí mé ag an am, I gcorca gaoine lámh le dún chuoin. Buachal óg in sta déarga ag iascach lá, nuair a dúirt an bádóir lam. Isn't it extraordinary that the Almighty God never created any two mackerel with the same pattern on their skins? That God lavished care on the pattern of each individual fish in the sea, each individual grain of sand, each individual blade of grass, each individual noseprint of a hound, each individual fingerprint of a human being, so no two people are created alike. Bryan said that this simple statement was fundamental to his attitude to life, that it is a privilege to meet and engage with a person who has never been created before and will never be created again. That simple statement by the fisherman, according to Bryan, is what the writer celebrates and the teacher cultivates. This sense of uniqueness cannot be taught, according to Bryan, but it can be conveyed. And conveyed Bryan did through his relationship with all he encountered, especially his pupils in the classroom. Bryan MacMahon was born on September the 29th, 1909 in Listowel, and passed through the gap of life on the 13th of February, 1998. His father, Pat MacMahon, was a clerk in a law office and a native Irish speaker involved with Douglas Hyde in the Gaelic League. His mother was a remarkable woman who originally taught in Liverpool for 10 years. Her name was Joanna Coughlin, and she was the eldest of 18, and 3 of her sisters were also teachers. Bryan first went to school with his mother to Clonmacon out in the country in a pony and trap. And here I am indebted to Dick Carmody, who sent me some background information written by Bryan about his attendance at Clonmacon School. Bryan's mother had been teaching in Lancashire for almost 10 years, returned home to marry, and then took up an appointment as assistant teacher in Clonmacon. Bryan describes his journey to Clonmacon on his first day in the winter of 1912. He says, "A small pony, a trap and a harness was bought for my mother. Off she went up Drummond Hill, the pony trotting, the brasses glittering, and the little silver bells on the harness gaily ringing. I was in the trap. I was dressed in a dark blue velvet suit with a lace collar as befitted the son of the schoolmistress." Later, Bryan went to Listowel Boys National School and then to St. Michael's College, Listowel, where he learned the classics, Latin and Greek, and where he was guided and inspired by his teacher there, Dr. Seamus Wilmot, and where Bryan says, "We had an atmosphere of literature and imagination around us always." In his book, Here's Ireland, Bryan says, "Dan Flavin's bookshop and a fine classical college named after the Archangel Michael produced a tribe of writers in our small community." Having sat for the King's Scholarship examination in 1920, Bryan got the call to training and entered St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, where Francis MacManus was a contemporary of his. On the very bottom of this slide, you will see the entry of Bryan's name and details in the college register in 1927. And in the top left photograph, Bryan is 6th from the left, sitting beside the priest. And in the photograph on the right-hand side of the college handball club, Bryan is 2nd from the left. And of course, Bryan played a leading role also in the establishment and development and support of the handball alley in Listowel. Bryan was selected as senior prefect in St. Patrick's College, even then at a young age, displaying exceptional personal qualities. This portrait of Bryan was commissioned by St. Patrick's College, Drumcondra, now an integral part of Dublin City University, and was unveiled in April 2008. And it is a proud testimony to one of its most illustrious and famous past pupils. I wish to thank St. Patrick's College, Dublin City University, for permission to show this lovely portrait during this talk. It is my considered opinion that a teacher's first teaching post has a profound influence on his or her subsequent career. Locality, culture, tradition, colleagues, during that first year all shape the perspectives, direction, and attitudes of the teacher for years to come. Bryan took up his first teaching post in St. Teresa's National School, Donore Avenue in Dublin, and taught there from 1930 to 1932. The locality at the time was markedly Jewish in character. His 3rd class had 60 to 70 pupils, and one of his pupils, incidentally, was Rory O'Connor, the name later a byword in traditional dancing. Teacher colleagues included the principal, Mr. Doody, who was a Newcastle Westman with a passion for hurling. Phil Moynihan, a fellow Kerry man who was a producer in Radio Éamon. Francis O'Sullivan, who had been with Bryan in training and who later became a music inspector and whom Bryan met very many times over the years. Another colleague that Bryan played football with in the evenings was Francis MacManus, the novelist, then a teacher in nearby Sing Street School before he took up a Radio Éamon appointment. Excuse me. This was the early 1930s, and it was a time of great idealism centered chiefly on the revival of the Irish language. And Bryan remembers entering his pupils for the under-10 competition for Irish conversation in Feis Clia with considerable success. When not teaching, Bryan helped with fellow teachers in organising the Gaelic Football League in Dublin. And it's interesting to note that he was also involved in meetings and discussions that led to the formation of the Educational Building Society, the first organisers of which were Tom Ryder, Dave Kelleher, who later became General Secretary of the INTO, and Harry McManus. And while in Dublin at that time, he palled around with Benji Hanlon, his friend from Listowel. One evening in Dublin, while queuing for a Jimmy O'D panto, Bryan was drenched to the skin and contracted the father and mother of a heavy cold. He found it hard to shake off the after effects. So he went home on sick leave. And while at home, he was offered a teaching post in the local school by the canon and reluctantly accepted it at his mother's insistence. And so began a 44-year teaching commitment in Listowel. Although his time in Dublin and in St. Teresa's Donore Avenue was short, it was an important influence on the impressionable young teacher that was Bryan MacMahon. In his hometown, he was appropriately and affectionately known as the Master MacMahon. Ranga Tree for me was an experience characterized each day by wonder, story, the unexpected, enjoyment, difference, and celebration. Every day was special in Bryan's classroom. We never knew what to expect. Bryan was a great teacher. He was an actor, singer, and storyman, and he used these teaching skills to great effect in class. In The Master, Bryan says, "If I could only plant a seed in the imagination of each one that would fructify later in unique individual. If only I could find the gift that I sensed was latent in each one of them, perhaps then I would have fulfilled the purpose of my being a teacher." Bryan MacMahon treasured his own gift of words and derived his deepest pleasure as a teacher from passing his passion for language, words, and reading on to his pupils. Bryan said that the teacher must have, above all, an infectious enthusiasm allied to knowledge in its wildest sense. And Benedict Kiley, writing in 1992 and referring to this statement of Bryan, said that, to put it mildly, that is a statement worth remembering, not only for teachers, but for those of us who never had the courage or the ability to work in that upper air. And Bryan regarded it as a privilege to teach. To teach for Bryan was to inculcate a sense of wonder, which is the basis of all creativity. I have often held that the greatest asset a teacher has is his or her voice. Bryan MacMahon had a magical gift of voice, and he delighted us with his stories each afternoon, as when lessons were finished, perched on the front desk in the class, he would take us into his magical world of stories, which included Jack O'Morga, the King of Ireland's son, Patsy O and his wonderful pets, and many others. Story was central to Bryan's work as teacher and writer. Bryan was the master. Bryan was the storyteller. Bryan was the master storyteller. He encouraged our fascination with words, getting us to collect, use, exchange, make up, and read words. Each day, he challenged us to introduce a new word we had discovered, and he had us listing words in a tiny red one-penny notebook, and it was not uncommon to hear his pupils under the trees by the front school wall in the schoolyard speaking as follows: "I will give you the word acknowledgements if you give me the word transubstantiation." And he instilled in us all his own love of words, reading, and literature, recognizing that no greater gift can be bestowed on a child than a love for reading. The gifts of individuality, creativity, and imagination were carefully nurtured. This blessed trinity is in all of us and is bursting to get out. The good educator, like Bryan, releases them. The good student then uses them, and the community is enriched by them. There are so many memories of our time in Bryan's class. A special day each year in his class was when he would bring us across the road to the Carnegie Library to Maisie Sweeney, the librarian, to receive from her our library tickets, introducing us into a new and exciting world of fact, fiction, fantasy, and fun. This done, of course, with due pomp, ceremony, and sense of occasion. And there were the songs and poems that we learned in class and that we retained for life, such as An Bríste Lahir, the Valley of Knockanure, the town of Listowel, My Silver River Free, and of course poems like An Old Woman of the Roads by Pádraig Colum, and many, many more. There are some books of Bryan's that I go back to time and time again, and one Ní Nachúna is the master. And every time I peruse it, I hear Bryan talking, teaching, performing, storytelling, singing, and acting. I remember so well the launch of the Master on the 15th of September 1992 in Scoil Rialta na Maidhne here in Listowel. It was a wonderful occasion, and afterwards I wrote as follows to Bryan: Ochid Wór Gotain o Cógáidechas ó Chrí. Ochid Chialúra é seo freisin that il omad ir scolári a fuid an down void a tá faoi chomín wóragat as an múine, as an múnla, as an inspiráid, agus as an féin vers a tugad dúin I de cheomra ranga, a bhí I gcónaí lán do gríocht, de haibhras na saoíochta agus de lucháin na litríochta agus na fálama. Mar waiste, thug tú agus bhún tú dúing tre de jach hampla hain, grád ar dír, meas dar nuchas, alum dar sincher, tuiscint dar tradiisiún, ceann ar maille, gan ar muintir, agus fiú dúil I rógaracht na riachta. A general sense of connection pervaded the book launch of The Master. A connection between the past, present, and future, between teachers of the past and teachers of the time, and between the proud and unique tradition of education in Kerry and the hope and promise for future students of Listowel. Bryan himself maintained that when teaching, one is drawing from the same reservoir of energy with which you write. And so we have the link between master and storyman, who defined the aim of his writing life as a literary exploration of the elusive, almost unbearable ache that lies at the heart of humanity. Bryan's lifeblood was books. In The Storyman, Bryan says, there's a hunger of the spirit for what lies beyond and a hunger of the body to which mankind must respond. But beneath the gentle lamplight, with words and image twined, a book shall serve to banish the hunger of the mind. The New York Herald Tribune said of Bryan, here is a writer who possesses the sensitivity of a poet and the rich, hearty humor of a peasant, a compassion for his fellow men, plus a rollicking remembrance of things past, a dramatist's understanding of conflict, a knowledge of the human heart, and a style as economical and exact as a theorem in geometry. In 1948, when The Lion Tamer and Other Stories was first published, a reviewer at the time stated, his stories possess a universality while their local setting fails to diminish. The narrator is a Kerry man, and the people he writes about are mostly Kerry people, but the drama, passion, and the sympathy which one finds in his stories are common to human life everywhere. He displays all the gifts of the storyteller in abundance: imaginative delicacy, quite unobtrusive humor, detachment, and he has the power of suggesting background and atmosphere that is quite remarkable. The fusion of opposites and the marriage of contradictions were important for Bryan. Bryan was an acute observer of the human condition and constantly strove to identify the commonality in diversity. This is particularly evident in his documentary and definitive writings on the traveling people. Another favourite book of mine is The Honey Spike. First written as a play, it was first performed in the Abbey in 1961 and later reworked by Bryan into the novel, which was published in 1967 and reissued by Poolbeg in 1993. It is a powerful story of two young travellers who, after a year of marriage, are awaiting the birth of the girl's first baby. The play focuses on the epic 5-day journey from the Giant's Causeway to a honey spike in County Kerry of the young pregnant traveller Breda and her husband Martin Claffey. There are many wonderful stories and interludes in this book and play which outline both the harsh realities and the natural freedom of travellers, their existence and their culture. Bryan was very familiar with their way of life and was one of the few outsiders who could speak Shelta, the secret language of the travelling people. While on a teacher's summer project in the University of Delaware in the USA in 1972, I came across the December 1971 issue of the American magazine Natural History, in which Bryan discusses the origins and indigenous nature of the travelling people and their secret language Shelta. Bryan concludes this extraordinary article by saying, "Mankind has as many layers as an onion, and when all these layers are peeled off, the core is tinker or gypsy. The traveller is in me, in you, in every man. Yet, compared with the tinker, we are lapdogs by the parlour fireside, quivering in commingled fear and ecstasy when, through the sound of the gusting storm outside, we hear the baying of wild dogs running free by the light of the moon." Listowel Drama Group was founded by Bryan in 1944. His buan chara Éamon Kelly, woodwork teacher in Listowel at the time, was also involved from the beginning. Éamon met his wife, Maura O'Sullivan, from Listowel through the drama group, and they both went on to join the Radio Éireann Repertory Company. The first production of Listowel Drama Group was staged on the 12th of January 1944, Troubled Bachelors by A.J. Stanley, and was staged at the Plaza. Bryan himself produced this first play. Bryan's own plays, The Bugle in the Blood, The Golden Folk, Jack Fury, The Death of Biddy Early, and The Master were all produced by the Listowel Drama Group. Bryan's play, The Bugle in the Blood, was produced in the Abbey Theatre in 1949. Song of the Anvil was the choice of the Abbey Theatre for the International Theatre Festival in 1960, and his play The Honey Spike, as mentioned earlier, was produced by the Abbey Theatre in 1961 and has won major national and international awards. The major achievements of Listowel Drama Group include winning the All-Ireland one-act play with George Fitzmaurice as the Magic Glasses, winning the All-Ireland three-act in Athlone with John B. Keane's Sign, and the recording of RTE and BBC of the Magic Glasses and other plays. So many people from the locality and the town were immersed in the work of the drama group, far too many for me to mention here, but I remember in particular John Flaherty and Bill Carney, tailor and soldier respectively, who performed in the Abbey and Peacock Theatres in Dublin, where they gave their interpretation of George Fitzmaurice's work in King of the Barneymen and the Magic Glasses. The rich, magical and mystical Kerry dialect was guaranteed by performances of Listowel actors Éamon Keane, Maura O'Sullivan, Bill Carney and John O'Flaherty. Éamon and Maura were professional actors at the time, while Bill and John, amateur members from Listowel Drama Group, were specially selected to give genuine and fulsome interpretation to Fitzmaurice's work. In a foreword to the theatre programme, Bryan wrote of them, "I'm glad that some of our own Kerry people are up there in Dublin to bring his fantasies to life again." Bryan, writing in 1952, said, "I consider that the Listowel Drama Group has succeeded in its objective to discover talent in our town and to make patent what is latent and to offer our citizens something of which they may grow proud." This is a wonderful photograph of the play, the set, the cast of The Master in 1993. It captures for me the charismatic and unique Bryan, regaling his young charges, enjoying the engagement with them, affirming and expressing pride in them. And here we see the writer, the actor, the master, the father and grandfather, as his son Owen and Owen's children proudly look on. Every time I look at this photograph, I delight in what it captures. It was Bryan that revived the pageant as form of appealing to large masses of people. He has written historical pageants which have been produced on major national occasions in Ireland. His personal contribution to the 1916 commemoration of the Easter Rising of 1916 was considerable, consisting of 4 plays for children on television, a major feature on radio, and Seach the Far Seach Law, the GAA pageant produced in Croke Park and Casement Park and subsequently televised. He also wrote Pageant of the Flag to mark the official opening of Markievicz Memorial Park, Sligo on the 21st of July 1957, and also Glór Éamon Fiosig in November 1979 to commemorate the centenary of the birth of Patrick Pearse. And of course, we have to make reference to Bryan the Ballad Maker, who enthralled listeners of Radio Éamon for so many years with his program, The Ballad Maker Saturday Night, and whose whole life was spent collecting, singing, and writing ballads. Excuse me. Bryan, writing about ballads in 1997, says, "Many years ago, lugging a cumbersome wire recorder in my wake and recording sounds for the program The Ballad Maker Saturday Night, which I designed and first scripted, I became increasingly aware of the richness of heritage I encountered. I hoped and prayed that the day of recognition for this lovely medium would dawn. Cúis áistam go bhfuil an lá sin tagatha a bhí san go mór leis na haibreóirí úntacha leis na seanár óránatha a dain an tine bheo, agus leis na ballachóirí ar a radio agus fós I meas ball cótas ceoltóirí Éamon. Go mara siad faoi bhair agus faoi bhadar." In the December 1942 issue of The Bell, he published an article entitled "I Made a Ballad," in which he describes in humorous detail the writing of one of his most loved ballads, The Town of Listowel. In this article, he says, "Collating my observations on the ballad, I came to the conclusion that the signs of the true ballad were as follows. First, a familiar subject expressed with a disconcerting, a disarming, at times even a brutal directness. Second, a merry procession with now and again 2 syllables jockeying for the one note and ending up by having it. Next, a shooting of words in their primary meanings, words not exactly striking the bull's-eye of meaning, but which are intimidated by the whine of the ricochets. And lastly, in a way somewhat similar to grand larceny, bathos on a tremendous scale. All Listowel people sing our own lovely ballad written by Bryan, The Town of Listowel. Let us just recall 2 verses. Beyond them the course there was Sid flashing past, the unfortunate nag that I backed he was last. When he rang the wrong way, sure I lost my control, and I prayed for the trainer and lovely Listowel. My rhyming is over, God bless those who heard, for I'll take to the roads and go off like a bird. And before I depart, well, you all must pay toll, so 3 cheers for the races and lovely Listowel." Another story I like to tell is about a ballad written by Bryan about the father of a very dear friend of mine, a nun, a member of the Carmelite order, a great scholar in her own right, who spoke Gaelic go bín blasta agus scríosi as Gaeilge sa seanachló Gaelach go néanadaí grásta iri. She was Sister Teresa and Tio Trasa. But Hiriachi, a daughter of the legendary Aeroplane O'Shea. And in 1993, she mentioned to me that Bryan had written something very special about her father. I asked Bryan about it, and in characteristic style, he forwarded her immediately a copy of The Old Kerry Footballer, a nostalgic interlude. Let us recall 2 of the stanzas that he wrote in that about her famous dad. "We stripped off by frozen ditches in the dark of winter time, till we glittered like bacon flitches with the snow and the rime. And we played upon boggy hillsides against a gale from the north and west, for we cherished but one ambition, to prove that Kerry was best. I and we treasured our ancient languages come noire de laumer maar de higemon narten duchish is in spirit is the faravivi. They maybe made jokes at our accents, let them laugh and guffaw once again, but we proved when the fray was fiercest that Kerry bred men. The Irish language was very dear to Bryan MacMahon, believing, as he said in 1994, Irish is a beautiful, sensuous instrument for expressing any emotion, and now it is in danger of dying. And in Here's Ireland, he wrote, the Irish language enshrines the beliefs, hopes, despairs, benedictions, maledictions, and valedictions of our people. Laur Brian Hain, Gaelige go bin blasta Liefa. An nói bhí grá meas agus ceann had an gcuitsinnig brian don Gaelige agus de chobar na Gaelige an Gaeltacht hain, agus de gacha bhain leis an Gaelige, al goltó Gaelch, ceol, cluichí, rinci, béal itis agus litríoch, agus chaise annach chud ama is na Gaeltachtaí ag súla a déana stadéir ar a deangain. Dúit páir go méláin I míle na géal sa seach go do dó, is beag cóhalán le tríochta na sóisialta bhí na gcuine hir an siúd le blianta fada ná go bheicá Bryan MacMahon agus Liam de Brún a blasan na dríochta in our measc, ní chéin strón séirí do chéile sin. Agus seo Brian agus ar nói Liam de Brún agus sa láran sin tá Eamon Ó Murchú meir. Trúr Gaeilgeoirí agus hain leo I gcónaí bheith caint le chéile as Gaeilge agus iad is iad a bhí go milliis bin blasta mar chaintsóirí na Gaeilge. Ba vinnig a laur Brian lein I ran go trí go ceolmhar mótasach faoi feig séir. Cé eile a ché leis an irid chéanna tuiscine agus leis an irid chéanna díalteachta den teanga a déirteach aistriúcháin ar théar feig a dhéanana. His translation of the autobiography of Peg Sayers, first published in 1974 and reprinted many times, is more than a labor of love. It is an act of genius, translating one world, the Gaelic pre-capitalist, pre-modern world of the Blasket Islands, to the hectic world of the 20th century, and he succeeds. He translates faithfully, closely, idiomatically, lovingly. Translation is not an ignoble art. It is an act sometimes of repossession, and so wrote Gabriel Fitzmaurice in Kerry on My Mind of Poets, Pedagogues and Place. Agus is léir ó aistriúcháin bhrian ar Peg, an boy agus tuiscint a bhí ag Brian ar héal, ar héhar agus a hanga village na Mascéireach. And as always, when we talk about Bryan MacMahon, we return to his own unique, special, beloved town of Listowel. Seamus Heaney put it well when he said, whatever your energy, wherever your consciousness springs from, the firstness of your very being springs from, that is your subject, is what wakens you and pre-awakens you. And Listowel was MacMahon's subject. It was where his consciousness sprung from. Bryan MacMahon consciously chose to live and work among the people of Listowel because it was these same people he would draw sustenance and inspiration from, and he would give in return the beauty of his own soul. In the Storyman, he writes, I possessed a satisfactory knowledge of my town and its hinterland as a simple nodule of humanity. I now had a clear sense of being completely at home with the toing and froing of the marketplace and the fair. I had a river flowing through my childhood, had experienced the game of life and death being cleared out of my door with the sheer exhilaration that accompanied it, had attended the informal schoolroom of the Smith's kitchen, as well as the formal attendance at a classic college. I was fully conscious of the uniqueness of each human being. I had an ear for dialect and dialogue, and an oddball acquaintance with secret areas of local existence. There's a marvelous account in the Storyman of the various colourful responses elicited by Bryan from his own people in the marketplace town and environs of Listowel when he asked the question, what way are you? And here are some of the responses he received. Perpendicular, no more. Keeping the best side out like the broken bowl in the dresser. If I felt any better, I'd see a doctor. My day is sound, I'm overground. Endeavouring to squeeze the last drop out of my endowments. I'll shortly be making a load for 4, shoving closer to the timber. And there is also a lovely response when he says, the most exotic and even surreal answer came from an old man who had a distant stare in his eyes. What way am I, is it? He shouted. I'll tell you then. I have a prolonged cough that's crying out for a cough bottle. I've a vindictive nerve pain in my right ankle. Every bone in my body is creaking, and still, and all my mind keeps turning to my mad uncle who spent the last days of his days cogitating how long it would take a small farmer to set an acre of oats, provided he dibbled in each grain separately with the point of a cobbler's hoe. In Bryan's posthumously published masterpiece, Hero Town, officially launched by Gabriel Fitzmaurice on the 4th of November 2011, Bryan poses the question, what is heroic about this place? And he asks, are all its citizens brave and admirable? Good God, no. They are truly human. They understand human relationships. If a man raises his head in pride, they lower it. If he lowers it, they raise it. It's an unarticulated law. It's handed down without courts. The people have familiars, totems, and taboos. They preserve the life of the imagination. Their communication is the shorthand of the nerves. They adore stories. Bryan was one of the founders of Writers' Week, along with Dr. Seamus Wilmot, Louis Murchú, Tim Danaher, Nora Relihan, John B. Keane, Denny Hannon, and others. It was Bryan, of course, who introduced the first writing workshop into Ireland when he first directed the short story workshop at Writers' Week in Listowel, and indeed he continued to do so for many years after. Bryan had for many years previously directed workshops in the United States, in the University of Iowa, where he had students and scholarships, their ages ranging from 20 to 35 years from all parts of the world. What prompted Bryan to introduce the workshop? Bryan's inspiration for workshop goes way back to the time that he himself started writing stories for the Bell. Founded by Sean O'Fuilán, Frank O'Connor, Peadar O'Donnell, Mollis Welch, and Ernie O'Malley, the Bell was most generous and helpful to young writers. And looking back, Bryan realized that O'Fuilán and O'Connor in particular, both of whom were important on a world scale, devoted a great amount of time to people like Bryan, and that was an important step forward in his life. He organized that first writers' workshop at Writers' Week to try and pay back in some measure the debt he owed to people like O'Connor and O'Fuilán. Small wonder then that when in June 1993, Bryan became the 21st recipient of the American Ireland Fund Literary Award, he was so thrilled to receive as a gift from his chairman, Dr. Tony O'Reilly, a complete set of copies of The Bell, the Irish literary magazine, edited by O'Fuilán, the magazine which gave him his first break as a writer. And Bryan, talking about that occasion, subsequently said, he has given me something beyond price, something I've always wanted. I had a few copies of the magazine myself, but I never thought I'd get a complete set together. This is a very precious gift, something I will always treasure. Imile Negias Sanochashacht, Scree Eilish ni Hulavan Dawn, almost Dagarhori, Shakton the Screenori. In a Yanan she pobble Listowel a Chelura, agus seo versa fwy vrian sa dawn. An morster goniol vi dealish a trolon an og. Far gashke mon peen noot nevig oran gan stro. De choilse a vrian, ni lian a glogger na glor, ach von chlok na fine, sor einshi leen na shanoi. But at his core, Bryan was a husband, father, grandfather, and family man. Married to Kitty Ryan of Cashel, County Tipperary, Bryan speaks about her so movingly in The Storyman as follows. Intuitively, aware of my adult head, my trying to do 40 things at the one time, she never intrudes on my writing self, just provided a safe anchorage of understanding. She was fact, I was fiction. Her home, her children, and her kinsfolk, these were her world. She was at her very best on Christmas Eve, the house decorated and shining, the Christmas tree blinking off and on, the delf gleaming, the parlour fire set, the smell of sherry trifle and spices in the air, her 5 sons in bed and agog for the arrival of Santa Claus. She then dressed herself in her best Christmas attire prior to attending midnight mass, and later walked about the house with such an air of utter domestic satisfaction that even her remote-minded husband was conscious of it. We were together for a long time, over half a century. But then, nothing lasts forever in this life. Bryan was a great friend to all sectors of the Listowel community and was respected and revered by all. He says, friendship in a small town is of the essence. People with whom you feel fully at home, who by intuition can sense your various mood swings and you theirs, and make allowances therefore. This is an absolute necessity for those who live in a small town. Of such a place it may be truly said that the houses have walls of glass. When his great friend Tim Cotter died, Bryan wrote an appreciation, and it is one of the finest pieces of its writing of its kind that I have ever read. And this is just a brief excerpt. One by one they leave us, those who it almost seems that if God, after he had made them and smiled and seen they were unique, had then decided to break the mold that gave them shape. Perhaps it is that although he was unlike anybody else, he was like everybody, and that there was so much of us in him and so much of him in us that we are unable to treat of him objectively. He was all that was vital in our beings being reduced to a healthy essence. He was one with our river flowing, our painted shops and our horse racing. He was the philomath, lingering after the age of philomaths has gone. He was the partisan par excellence, the footballer fielding and the natural equal of any emergency. He was the play, the mime, the recitation, the song, the contradiction that called up echoes from chasms deep in us. His was the delight of words placed in their adorable order, and his was the unfettered and unfetterable heart. Those who knew him require no touchstone to recall him. Those who did not know him can never have him explained to them. Bryan loved people. He loved language. He loved life. And so, tá an clog buailte, seasaigh, umpagaigh, siúlagaigh. Is mar sin a dearach má bháiste scala, Bryan MacMahon ag deire lei I rang trí. Agus tá deire inis le mochad cainte. Master, storyman, and friend. Master of the imagination and of storied Listowel. When one asked Bryan Constantu, he invariably replied, Madam Foss, I live yet. Agus tréna scríbhní, Madam Lorga Loide. Tréna bhuain tóracht, mar an tioncada intine agus a jalsúnachta, agus tréna charitas ling, mar an grá doscuilte and as can baile Listowel, muinter an baile agus an chantar hart le Brian hain. He was, of course, to all who knew him personally, an anamchara, a soul friend in the real sense of that word. For me, Bryan was a very special friend who enjoyed people and who cared for and respected their most precious possessions, their thoughts. Let us leave the last word to Bryan himself. For the last time, I'll endeavor to instruct the youth, and then I'll raise my voice no more. I consider it the duty of at least one old man in every generation to pass on the ferocity he has inherited. Often and often I have told ye of the kind of place ye were born into. I have striven to raise in ye a pride for the noble people before ye who fell in love with human nature and through human nature fell in love with God. I have striven to convey before now that the young life as I lived it was so thronged with small beauties that you wouldn't think 'twas sons and daughters of the flesh we were, but children of the rainbow, dwelling always in the morning of the world. And if only the all-seeing God had seen fit to send us a man with the gift of ink, then maybe the story of our small wonders will go shouting to the borders of the nations. Good morning.